a presentation first by Jean-Jacques Sahel. So I'm pleased to invite Jean-Jacques to the podium, Vice President at Skype. Jean-Jacques.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I hear that your expectations are not really that high after the chairman's kind words. He has asked me to mention the fact that he's got a great book out for sale called... Yeah, but I should repeat it so people hear it again. I'm not going to tell any jokes. I'm going to launch straight into my presentation. And it's not a presentation which is overly focused on regulation, although there are aspects of it, of course. What I wanted to really talk about today, or give you an insight on, is really think about the place that content applications and services play in what we're talking about here, and the wider social and economic aspects of content applications and services that run over the networks that many of you in the room are in charge of either deploying or helping to deploy through intelligent regulation and policies. So if we just look a little bit at the Internet and the history of the Internet, what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, probably 30 years or so, is really this move increasingly from the hardware to the software in terms of the importance for the wider economy and society. We've moved from an era of mainframes to an era slowly of mini-computers, then PCs, and increasingly then from the late 1980s onwards to the desktop internet, increasingly the mobile internet, and now that's shifting towards the mobile consumer and citizen. And it's the era of the software. Everybody's talking about apps and has for the past 2 or 3 years. This is really the information age coming to fruition, so to speak. And in this world where you have more and more internet-connected devices, it's not just desktop, it's increasingly those mobile phones or tablets, and TVs are actually increasingly connected to the internet. What's increasingly important is what is platform agnostic. It's the applications and the content that you can access through these devices as long as they are connected to the internet. That's what is increasingly driving consumer demand. It's not actually where or how you use it, it's what you use, what you can do for the through the networks being available. And if we look in terms of economics, and we've heard already quite a few figures, I think this is from the OECD, obviously, over the past only just 10, 15 years or so, the pace of innovation and its contribution to social and economic progress and welfare has been quite amazing. And one would say, unprecedented in history. If we think at how quickly all these innovations have come to the fore, just think about the fact that if you look at this, at Wi-Fi, really only happened around 2000. Things like 3G, 99. And then you look at some of the stuff that's on the top there, PayPal, eBay, Google, Napster, Skype itself, we mentioned there, Second Life, Google Earth, YouTube, Facebook, etc. The innovation actually keeps speeding up, if anything. And what you see there is actually that increasingly in the value chain for ICT, we still have a virtuous cycle, a symbiotic ecosystem where all parts of this value chain are linked to one another and are dependent on one another. But clearly, value is moving up the value chains. Layer 1 and Layer 2, the equipment, the networks, are still extremely important, clearly. But in terms of user demand, what really drives it all and what really will benefit the economy is this over-the-top layer. It's the content, the services, the applications that you as a user can use, that you as a public service can use, that you as a business can use, and therefore lead to increased social welfare and economic growth. You've seen the figures at the top. Vivian Redding was fond of this statistic that that ICT has driven a 40% productivity growth in the EU. The OECD itself calculated that across the OECD member states, ICT since 1995 has contributed to a 0.5% annual increase in economic growth. So this is actually quite world changing. I think we all intuitively know that, but it's good to look at the figures. But now if we step back for a second, and we remember that what matters increasingly is not the high-speed networks themselves, but what rides over those high-speed networks. Well, two things are important. One is we need to always make sure that this information, these applications, this content and these services are as widely accessible as possible. That's why we want the high-speed networks. We don't want the high-speed networks because we like the idea of having a satellite dish on our roof, or because we like to have a cable arriving at our house, or indeed a mobile phone that can connect to the internet. We like that because we as users, or indeed as economies, as businesses and as organizations, want to enjoy it to generate wider socio-economic benefits. The other thing is, if we look at Europe specifically, is that if we look at the number of European companies in the ICT world, we're actually doing pretty well in what some people call layers 1 and 2. In terms of equipment manufacturing in ICT, we're pretty strong. We've got some great companies like Nokia, Siemens, or Alcatel-Lucent, Ericsson and others. If we look at layer 2, in terms of networks, in terms of telecom operators, Europe is actually a world leader. We've got some of the largest multinationals in the telecommunications world. I don't need to cite them. You've seen some this morning on the podium. It's actually quite remarkable. Many of them have got in excess of, well, actually 300 million subscribers. I mean, this is pretty impressive. But now, if we look at the layers above, the content, services and applications, which increasingly, as we witness here and as we hear in the press every day, is becoming more and more important, and where the value is shifting, Europe is actually not really that well placed. You can just think about how many internet companies you know that are coming out of Europe. You might have heard about Spotify, you might have heard about Skype. There's not that many more. If you look at, this is an arbitrary piece of statistic if you want, but if you look at the Fortune 500 companies in the world, we do find all these great European layer 1 and layer 2 companies. You know, there's dozens of them, of equipment manufacturers and telecom companies. But in terms of content and applications providers, internet companies, actually the only one European company out of the top 500 companies in the world that is in the internet sphere is Vivendi. And actually Vivendi is not what one might call a pure internet company. It's a massive conglomerate that spans a lot of sectors. Whereas if you compare that to other regions of the globe, like North America and like Northeast Asia, they have dozens of those internet companies. Even places like Russia have got many more companies in that sphere, Russia on its own, than the whole of Europe. So if we look ahead to the future and to the 21st century, where really Europe has to think really hard about being active in high value-added industries, such as the internet economy, we need to do a lot more work if we want to be globally competitive. We have to really think about how we can encourage innovators to prosper in Europe so that we can be strong not just in layers 1 and 2, but in the internet content layer. And this is paramount if we want Europe to remain competitive, if we want ourselves and also our children to have jobs in the future, and good jobs. So with that in mind, I'd just like to move on to some more specific policy-oriented considerations. First, clearly we need to move conceptually to the 21st century. A lot of our rules and regulations, and that's not just true in telecoms, it's true across the board, are based at the very best in the 20th century. Okay, I am very, very proud of having done my thesis on the International Telecoms Union. And you think about it, it was actually created in 1865. And if you look at the amount of change in the convention and constitution of the ITU since 1865, you'd be amazed to see how little it has changed. That says a lot about how we might need to think differently if we really want to have innovation truly guiding how Europe benefits from the internet, both as a user and as a producer, as an industry, as a globally competitive industry. So really, it's shifting again. I'm not going into much detail, this is for the consultations that we've responded to the European Commission and many regulators around the room, and that you can find on the internet. But really, we need to think about maintaining a high standard of regulation, but lowering this burden of regulation. It's being more efficient, more forward-looking, and really with regulation bias towards innovation. It means that every time that we're, for instance, taking a new set of directives and applying them into national law, and then deriving them into specific national regulations, we need to think, how is that going to affect innovators in my country, innovators around the EU? We really need to think about that hard, including for one important point, which is that if you look at the internet economy, in particular in Europe, we actually have hundreds and thousands of internet innovators, but they're tiny. They don't have policy people. They don't have regulators. I'll just give you a little example. For instance, Skype, European company, internet company, one person to deal with policy for Europe, Middle East and Africa. Typical European telecom company, 10 plus people, not all of them, I agree, I know some of you in the room that travel far too much, but many big telecom companies in Europe, 10 plus people in Brussels alone. Okay, so as regulators, if we want to ensure that we deliver not just for the traditional telecoms industry, but for the wider economy, which is part of the remit, we need to ensure that we think about these guys, that we think about how our regulations are going to impact on these small guys that, unfortunately, for one reason or another, we can't always meet and understand because we're not in touch with them so often.